My 9-year-old Emma used to wake up at 6 a.m. and drag me to school in her dinosaur dress until Mr. Creep made her sit in his red leather thinking chair all day with no bathroom breaks. She wet herself while he whispered, "You're the stupidest kid I've ever taught." I found her at 3 a.m. training her bladder in case Mr. Creep makes me sit tomorrow. When we started showing up at his coffee shop every morning just to watch him, his hands started shaking so bad he couldn't hold his cup. My daughter Emma used to love school. She'd wake up at 6 a.m. on her own, pick out her favorite dinosaur dress, and practically drag me to the car. That was before Mr. Creep. 4th grade started like any other year. Emma was excited about her new teacher. He was young, coached soccer, had a therapy dog that visited on Fridays. All the parents thought we'd hit the jackpot. The kids who'd had him before seemed to love him. What I didn't notice was how quiet those kids had become. The first sign something was wrong came in October. Emma stopped talking about school. When I asked about her day, she'd say fine and disappear into her room. She quit raising her hand in class. Her sparkle just dimmed. I figured it was a phase. Maybe she was growing up, becoming self-conscious. I was so wrong. Mr. Creep had this special chair in his classroom, red leather, right next to his desk. He called it the thinking chair. When kids messed up, forgot homework, talked in class, got a problem wrong, they'd sit in that chair while he lectured them. But here's what the other parents didn't know. He'd make them sit there all day. No lunch, no recess, no bathroom breaks. Emma wet herself in that chair. She was too ashamed to tell me. I found out from her friend Lily's mom, who heard it from her daughter weeks later. When I confronted Emma, she broke down sobbing so hard she threw up. That's when the floodgates opened. Mr. Creep would lean down and whisper things to kids in the thinking chair, things only they could hear. "Your parents are going to be so disappointed. Everyone's laughing at you. You're the stupidest kid I've ever taught. Maybe you should just stop coming to school." He'd smile at the class while he did it, so everyone thought he was being encouraging. He had other tricks too. If a kid tried to tell their parents, he'd call them a liar in front of the whole class the next day. He'd make them stand up and apologize for making up stories. Then he'd send a cheerful email to parents about how their child was working through some attention-seeking behaviors, and he was helping them develop better honesty habits. The kids learned fast. Telling meant humiliation. Emma started having panic attacks. She'd throw up before school. She'd claw at her arms until they bled. One morning, I found her in the bathroom at 3 a.m., practicing holding her pee, in case Mr. Creep makes me sit in the chair tomorrow. My 9-year-old was training her bladder because her teacher was a monster. I tried the proper channels first. I really did. The principal said Mr. Creep was a beloved educator with unconventional but effective methods. When I insisted on a meeting, Creep was ready. He showed up with a folder full of Emma's work, concern dripping from his voice. He said Emma was struggling with the transition to 4th grade and had become manipulative when faced with accountability. He suggested she might have oppositional defiant disorder. He recommended a psychiatrist. The principal ate it up. Other parents started coming forward quietly. Lily's mom, Jackson's dad, Aiden's grandma, all with similar stories. Kids who used to love learning now faked sick to avoid school. Kids who wet themselves rather than ask for the bathroom. Kids who'd gone from chatty to silent. But Creep was smart. He'd been doing this for years. He kept meticulous records that painted him as a dedicated teacher dealing with difficult children. He volunteered for every committee. He ran the school's anti-bullying program. Who would believe a bunch of problem kids over him? Then I found out about Marcus. Marcus had been in Creep's class 3 years earlier. His mom, Diane, reached out after hearing I was asking questions. Marcus was 15 now. He'd tried to unalive himself twice. In his sewer slide note, he mentioned the thinking chair. He mentioned Mr. Creep's whispers. He said he could still hear them sometimes, telling him he was worthless. That's when I knew the proper channels were bullpoop. I started watching Creep, learning his routines. He went to the same coffee shop every morning at 6:45, hit the gym Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays at 4 p.m., walked his golden retriever at the park near his condo every night at 8, grocery shopping on Sundays, dinner at his mom's every Thursday. The man was predictable, comfortable, untouchable. During one of my observation sessions, I noticed something interesting. Creep kept checking over his shoulder at the coffee shop. When someone sat too close at the gym, he'd move to a different machine. If another dog walker took the same path at the park, he'd abruptly change direction. Mr. Creep didn't like being watched. At the next parent meeting in my living room, there were 12 of us now. I mentioned this quirk. Diane's eyes lit up. Marcus said Creep hated when parents observed class. He'd get sweaty and stumble over words. Jackson's dad leaned forward. He complained to the principal about me volunteering too much, said I was disrupting the learning environment. That's when the plan started forming. We couldn't hit him through the system, but maybe we could hit him at his own game. What if, I said slowly, we made him feel how our kids feel? Watched, judged, powerless. The room went quiet. Then Lily's mom smiled. "Tell me more." The next morning, I watched Creep from across the street as he entered his usual coffee shop. Same time, same table by the window, same order. I pulled out my phone and texted the group chat we'd created. Phase 1 starts now. Within minutes, Jackson's dad walked into the coffee shop. He didn't approach Creep, just took a seat 3 tables away with a newspaper. 5 minutes later, Aiden's grandma entered, ordering her coffee and settling at the counter where she had a clear view of Creep's table. I watched through the window as Creep shifted in his seat. His eyes darted between Jackson's dad and Aiden's grandma. When Lily's mom entered 10 minutes later, Creep's hand trembled slightly as he lifted his coffee cup. None of us spoke to him. None of us even looked directly at him. We were just there, present, watching without watching. Creep left 15 minutes early, his coffee half finished. That afternoon, 3 parents signed up to volunteer in the classroom. The principal approved it immediately, thrilled by the increased parental involvement. Creep's smile when he saw us was tight, forced. He stumbled over his words twice during the math lesson. The thinking chair remained empty that day. Emma came home lighter somehow. She actually ate dinner without prompting. When I tucked her in, she whispered that Mr. Creep had been weird all day. "He kept looking at you, moms," she said, "and he forgot to give us homework." The parent network grew. Word Word spread through careful whispers at pickup, hushed conversations at soccer practice. We now had 17 families. Not everyone participated in the surveillance, but they all shared information. We learned that Creep had a pattern spanning 7 years. Always 4th grade, always the same methods, always children too scared to speak up until years later. Diane discovered something crucial during her research. 3 families had moved away suddenly over the years, all with children from Creep's class. She tracked down one mother through social media. The woman broke down on the phone, describing how her son had become suicidal in 5th grade. They'd moved to get him away from the memories. She'd tried to warn the school, but without proof, her concerns were dismissed as an overreaction. We kept up the pressure. Every morning, someone was at the coffee shop. During his gym sessions, a parent would always happen to be working out nearby. The dog park became a rotating schedule of evening strollers who just happened to cross his path. Creep started making mistakes. He snapped at a student in front of a volunteering parent. He forgot to submit lesson plans. He showed up late twice in 1 week. The principal called him in for a check-in meeting. But Creep was a survivor. He'd been doing this for years. He started varying his routines, taking different routes to work, shopping at different stores. He complained to the principal about feeling harassed by parents. He suggested we were conspiring against him because he held our children to high standards. The principal called me in for a meeting. She expressed concern about the unusual level of parental oversight in Mr. Creep's classroom. She suggested we were creating a hostile work environment. I smiled politely and reminded her that parental involvement was encouraged by the school board. I had the handbook quoted and highlighted. She couldn't argue with policy. That night, our living room was packed. Parents sat on every available surface, voices low but urgent. Some wanted to back off, worried about retaliation. Others wanted to escalate. He's adapting, Diane said. We need to be smarter. Marcus sat beside her, the first time he'd joined us. At 15, he looked hollow, older than his years. He spoke quietly about the whispers that still haunted him, about how Creep would smile while destroying a child's spirit, about how he'd thought about dying just to make the voices stop. The room fell silent. Then Jackson's dad stood up. My son wets the bed. He's 9 years old and he wets the bed because he's terrified of asking to use the bathroom at school. His voice cracked. I'm not backing down. We refined our approach. Instead of obvious surveillance, we became subtle. A parent happened to jog past his condo during his dog walks. Someone always seemed to be shopping when he was, just a few aisles over. We learned his patterns so well we could predict where he'd be without following him. The psychological pressure was working. Creep's teaching became erratic. He assigned less homework, held fewer thinking chair sessions. The volunteering parents reported that he seemed constantly on edge, checking the door, startling at unexpected sounds. Something feels different about how these parents are organizing. They're not just complaining at PTA meetings, they're actually tracking this teacher's every move. The way Emma went from loving school to training her bladder at 3 a.m. makes me wonder what else this Creep guy was doing behind that classroom door that nobody saw, but we'd underestimated him. One morning, Emma came to breakfast pale and shaking. She handed me a note, her hands trembling. It was typed, no signature. Your mother is causing problems. Stop her, or everyone will know what you did in the thinking chair. My vision went red. I drove to school ready to confront him, but Diane intercepted me in the parking lot. Don't, she said. This is what he wants. You go in there angry, he wins. She was right. Creep had escalated to threatening the children. We called an emergency meeting that night. The note had been slipped into Emma's backpack during recess. No cameras covered that area. No proof it was him. 3 other children had received similar notes, each personalized, each hitting their deepest shame. Lily's mentioned her accident. Jackson's referenced his tears. Aiden's brought up his stutter that emerged after the thinking chair sessions. He's fighting back, I said, getting desperate. Good, Diane replied. Desperate people make mistakes. We decided to document everything. Every note, every incident, every behavioral change in our children. We created a shared drive, password protected, backing up everything in multiple locations. We may not have had legal proof yet, but we were building a pattern that would be hard to ignore. The next phase required more finesse. We couldn't just watch him anymore. We needed him to reveal himself, to crack under the pressure he'd applied to our children for years. Lily's mom had an idea. What if we give him exactly what he fears most? An audience he can't control. The plan was delicate. We'd continue the volunteer rotation, but now we'd bring notebooks, take obvious notes during class. Not about him technically, about our children's progress, about the classroom environment, about teaching methods, all perfectly within our rights as parents. Creep noticed immediately. His hands shook slightly as he wrote on the board. He assigned no thinking chair punishments that week. He was careful, controlled, but the strain showed. Then Marcus did something brave. He asked to visit his old classroom, to face his fears, as his therapist suggested. The principal, unaware of our campaign, thought it was a wonderful idea. Healing, closure. Marcus stood in that classroom, looking at the red leather chair. Creep's face went white when he saw him. Marcus said nothing, just stood there for 5 minutes, then left. But the message was clear. We remember. We know. We're not going away. That afternoon, Creep requested a substitute for the next day, claiming illness, but we knew better. He spent that day at his lawyer's office. We knew because Aiden's uncle worked in the building and happened to see him in the lobby, looking haggard. The war had truly begun, and we were ready for whatever came next. The lawyer's visit changed everything. Creep came back to school with a new strategy. He started documenting every parent interaction, taking photos of us in the hallways, recording volunteer sessions. The principal sent out a memo about maintaining professional boundaries and respecting educator privacy. But we had momentum now, 23 families strong, with more joining quietly each week. Linda, whose daughter had been in Creep's class 2 years ago, brought us something invaluable. She'd kept a journal during that year, documenting her daughter's behavioral changes, the excuses from school, the gradual transformation of a happy child into an anxious wreck. The patterns were undeniable. undeniable when laid out chronologically. Every child followed the same trajectory: enthusiasm to withdrawal, confidence to fear, trust to trauma. We adjusted our tactics. Instead of obvious surveillance, we created a support network. Parents would arrive early for pickup, gathering in small groups near the playground where we could see Creep's classroom windows. We organized playdates specifically for affected children, giving them safe spaces to talk. The kids began opening up to each other in ways they couldn't with adults. Emma started sleeping through the night again. Small victories mattered. Creep noticed the solidarity. He began keeping students after the bell, releasing them one by one to prevent parents from gathering. He rearranged his classroom so the thinking chair wasn't visible from the windows. He stopped using school email for anything beyond mandatory communications. During a volunteer session, I watched him teaching. Without the thinking chair as a threat, his control had weakened. Students whispered when he turned to write on the board. Papers rustled. Pencils dropped. Normal classroom sounds that would have resulted in punishment before now went unchecked. He couldn't discipline them with parents watching. His frustration was visible in the rigid set of his shoulders, the white-knuckled grip on his markers, the forced smile that never reached his eyes. After class, I lingered to help Emma pack up. Creep approached, maintaining careful distance, his voice professionally neutral as he informed me that Emma was struggling with focus. I nodded, took notes, asked follow-up questions about specific assignments. He had no ammunition when I remained calm and engaged. That evening, Diane called an emergency meeting. Marcus had found something. In an online forum for survivors of emotional abuse, there were posts dating back 5 years. Anonymous, but the details were unmistakable. The red chair, the whispers, the systematic destruction of children's self-worth. 3 different accounts, all describing Creep's methods. We printed everything. The forum posts, Linda's journal, our documentation. The stack of papers grew thick with evidence of a pattern spanning nearly a decade. But patterns weren't proof. We needed more. Jackson's dad suggested we expand our volunteer presence. If one parent made Creep nervous, what would 4 do? The principal couldn't refuse without explaining why this particular classroom needed less oversight than others. We created a schedule: morning reading help, math assistance after lunch, art project supervision, science experiment support, always helpful, always professional, always watching. Creep's composure cracked incrementally. He started making errors in his lesson plans, mixed up student names, forgot which assignments he'd given. The thinking chair gathered dust in the corner, transformed from weapon to furniture. The children noticed. They began raising their hands again, asking questions, making mistakes without flinching. The classroom atmosphere shifted like seasons changing, gradual but undeniable. Emma drew pictures again, bright colors instead of dark scribbles, dinosaurs and rainbows instead of black clouds. She still had nightmares, but they came less frequently. Creep tried to regain control through other means. Pop quizzes increased, homework doubled. He sent notes home about concerning behaviors that required parent conferences. But we compared notes, recognized the manipulation. When 5 parents received identical concerns about their children's social development, we knew he was grasping for leverage. We attended every conference as a group. 3 or 4 parents would show up to discuss their child, taking detailed notes, asking for specific examples and documentation. Creep would stammer through vague generalizations while we pressed for facts. The principal grew uncomfortable with the dynamic. She suggested we were being unnecessarily adversarial. I reminded her that involved parents were an asset to any school. She had no counter-argument that wouldn't sound suspicious. Creep's next move was clever. He requested a student teacher, claiming he wanted to mentor new educators. The principal approved enthusiastically. Now he had a witness, someone who could testify to parent harassment if needed. The student teacher, a young woman named Joni, arrived full of enthusiasm. Creep performed for her, the dedicated educator dealing with difficult parents. He pointed out our constant presence, our note-taking, our questions. He painted us as helicopter parents undermining his authority. But Joni had eyes. She saw how the children tensed when Creep's voice sharpened, noticed how they glanced at the thinking chair even though it hadn't been used in weeks, observed the way Emma and others kept their heads down, avoiding attention. During her second week, Joni approached me after school. She asked careful questions about the parent volunteer schedule, mentioned how involved we all seemed. I kept my answers neutral, focusing on how much we valued our children's education. She nodded, but I caught her watching Creep more closely after that, saw her frown when he snapped at a student for dropping a pencil, noticed her discomfort when he held the class late, making them sit in silence while parents waited outside. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Nathan, the school janitor, approached Diane one evening. He'd worked there for 15 years, had seen things. He knew about the thinking chair, had found children hiding in bathrooms crying, had mopped up accidents when kids were too scared to ask for breaks. He'd kept quiet, not his place to interfere, but watching us fight for our children had stirred something. He offered to share what he'd witnessed, though he couldn't do so officially. His job depended on staying neutral. We didn't ask him to risk his livelihood. Instead, we asked him to simply be present, to clean the classroom during volunteer hours, to maintain the hallways when parents gathered, to be another set of eyes, even if those eyes couldn't speak. Creep's paranoia escalated. He started locking his classroom during lunch, claiming student privacy. He covered the door window with student artwork. He requested that parent volunteers be limited to 1 per day. The principal, caught between policy and pressure, suggested a compromise. Parent volunteers could continue, but they needed to sign in at the office first and wear visitor badges. Smart move bringing notebooks to class. Nothing says "I'm watching you" quite like taking notes on someone's teaching methods while they sweat through their lesson plan. Creep requesting a lawyer visit instead of actually being sick. We agreed readily. Official documentation of our presence only strengthened our position. The student teacher Joni lasted 3 weeks. She submitted a request to be reassigned, citing philosophical differences in teaching approaches. When pressed, first, she remained professionally vague, but her departure spoke volumes. Creep's mask slipped further. Without his witness, with parents constantly present, with children growing bolder, his control mechanisms failed. He assigned detention for minor infractions, only to have parents show up to observe. He threatened poor grades, but we requested detailed rubrics and grading criteria. Every weapon in his arsenal met with calm, organized resistance. The children began to heal in small ways. Lily stopped chewing her nails. Jackson asked to use the bathroom without fear. Aiden's stutter improved. They still carried damage, might always carry it, but they were learning that adults could protect them too. Emma started a journal at her therapist's suggestion. She showed me one entry. Mr. Creep seems scared now, like how I used to feel, but I'm not glad. I just want him to stop being mean. Even in her pain, she had more compassion than he'd ever shown. The tipping point came during a routine fire drill. As classes filed out, Creep grabbed Emma's shoulder, holding her back. He leaned down, whispered something that made her face go white. By the time they reached the evacuation point, she was shaking. I saw it happen from across the playground where I'd been volunteering in the library. By the time I reached her, other parents had noticed too. Emma couldn't speak, just shook her head when I asked what he'd said. But Lily had heard. Brave Lily, who'd found her voice again, told us later. Creep had whispered that Emma's mother was ruining his life, that it was Emma's fault for telling lies, that things would get much worse if we didn't stop. We had him, threatening a child in front of a witness. But Lily was 9, her word against a veteran teacher's. We needed more. That night, our living room overflowed with fury. Parents who'd been hesitant about our methods now demanded action. Some wanted to confront him physically. Others suggested going to the media. The careful coalition we'd built threatened to fracture into mob mentality. Diane's voice cut through the anger. She reminded us why we'd started this. Not for revenge, but for protection. Not to destroy Creep, but to stop him from destroying more children. We had to be better than him, or we'd prove his narrative right. We developed a new strategy. Instead of surveillance, we'd create transparency. Every parent would request detailed daily reports on their child's behavior and academic progress. We'd ask for copies of all assignments, rubrics, and classroom policies. We'd schedule monthly conferences to review progress. We'd document everything in writing. The paperwork alone would bury him, but more importantly, it would force him to justify every decision, every discipline, every grade. No more whispered threats, no more power exercised in shadow. Creep fought back with bureaucracy. He claimed the requests were excessive, that providing such detailed documentation would prevent him from actually teaching. The principal, overwhelmed by the volume of formal requests, suggested we were being unreasonable. I pulled out the school handbook again. Parent rights to educational records, state guidelines on classroom transparency, district policies on parent engagement. Every request we'd made fell within established parameters. The principal had no choice but to comply. Creep spent hours after school preparing reports. His teaching suffered as he focused on documentation. The thinking chair disappeared entirely, removed one weekend without explanation. He stopped calling on students he deemed problematic, avoiding any interaction that might require documentation. But isolation was another form of abuse. When 5 children went a full week without being called on despite raising their hands, we documented that too. When he forgot to include certain students in group activities, we noted the pattern. When he excluded Emma from a class celebration due to a paperwork error, we had evidence. The weight of maintaining his facade while under constant scrutiny took its toll. Creep's appearance deteriorated. His clothes wrinkled, his patience thinned, his careful control crumbled. He snapped at colleagues, missed faculty meetings, submitted grades late. Other teachers began to notice. Some who defended him before grew quiet. The art teacher mentioned to Lily's mom how much happier the children seemed during specials. The music teacher commented on their improved participation. The PE coach noted they were playing again instead of standing on the sidelines. Without saying anything directly, the faculty understood something had shifted. Marcus visited the classroom again. This time, he brought a letter. He stood at the front of the room during lunch, when only Creep was present, and read it aloud. The letter detailed every whisper, every humiliation, every moment that had driven him toward darkness. He named specific dates, quoted exact words, described the lasting damage. Then he left the letter on Creep's desk and walked out. Creep tried to destroy it, but Nathan had been cleaning nearby. He mentioned casually that he'd seen Marcus deliver something, wondered if it was important. Word spread that evidence had been submitted. We never claimed it was official, never said where it went. But Creep didn't know what we'd done with Marcus's testimony. The not knowing tortured him more than any certainty could have. Parents outside our group began asking questions. Why did Mr. Creep's class have so many volunteers? Why were so many children in therapy? Why did kids who'd loved school suddenly develop anxiety? We didn't spread rumors. We simply shared our experiences when asked. Yes, our children had struggled. Yes, we'd increased our involvement as a result. Yes, we'd noticed improvement since becoming more present in the classroom. The truth spoke for itself. Creep made one last desperate play. He requested a meeting with all concerned parents, mediated by the principal and the district's human resources representative. He wanted to address our harassment directly, clear the air, find a path forward. We agreed immediately. 23 parents confirmed attendance. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening. We prepared carefully, organizing our documentation, selecting spokespersons, agreeing on talking points. We wouldn't attack. We'd simply present our concerns with evidence and ask for accountability. Creep prepared too. He arrived with his own files, his own narrative, his own version of events. He'd crafted a story of dedicated teaching sabotaged by vindictive parents. He had emails taken out of context, photos of parents stalking him, documentation of our coordinated harassment. The HR representative, a stern woman named Jules, listened to both sides with professional neutrality. She asked probing questions, requested specific examples, pushed for verifiable facts rather than interpretations. As the meeting morning progressed, cracks appeared in Creep's story. He couldn't explain why so many children had developed similar symptoms. He had no answer for the forum posts predating our involvement. He fumbled when asked about the thinking chair, claiming it was a reflection space, while unable to justify keeping children there all day. When Diane presented Marcus's letter, read his words about wanting to die rather than disappoint Mr. Creep again, the room fell silent. Even the principal looked shaken. Creep tried to dismiss it as a troubled teen seeking attention, but Jules asked a simple question. Why would a 15-year-old fabricate such specific details about events from 3 years ago? He had no answer. We presented Linda's journal, the documented behavioral changes, the timeline of trauma. We shared the anonymous notes slipped into backpacks, the whispered threats, the systematic emotional destruction of 9-year-olds. Creep's rebuttals grew weaker. He shifted from denial to justification to blaming the children themselves. He suggested they were manipulative, oversensitive, enabled by permissive parenting. He painted himself as the victim of a witch hunt. But evidence has weight, patterns have power, and 23 families telling the same story created a truth too heavy to dismiss. Jules requested a recess. When we reconvened, she announced that the district would be conducting a formal investigation. Creep would be placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. A substitute would finish the school year. It wasn't victory, not yet, but our children wouldn't have to face him tomorrow. As parents filtered out, some crying with relief, others angry it had taken so long, I felt Emma's hand slip into mine. She'd insisted on coming, on facing him one last time. She'd sat silent through the meeting, but her presence had spoken louder than any words. Creep packed his things under supervision, his movements sharp with suppressed rage. As he passed our group, he stopped. For a moment, I thought he might speak, might finally acknowledge what he'd done. Instead, he looked at Emma and smiled. The same smile he'd worn while whispering poison in small ears. The same smile that had hidden cruelty behind authority. Emma didn't flinch. She stood straighter, met his gaze, and didn't look away until he did. In that moment, I saw her strength. Despite everything he'd taken from her, he hadn't broken her spirit completely. She was still fighting, still standing, still brave. The investigation would take weeks. There would be interviews, reviews, bureaucratic processes. Some parents wanted to push further, to ensure he never taught again. Others just wanted to move forward, to focus on healing. Creep asking for a meeting to address harassment is like the wolf complaining the sheep are being mean by building a fence. You have to admire the sheer audacity of playing victim after terrorizing 9-year-olds. But that night, Emma ate dinner without prompting. She laughed at her father's terrible jokes. She asked if she could have a friend over on Saturday. Small victories, tiny resurrections, the slow journey back from darkness. The war wasn't over. Creep would likely find another district, another classroom, another set of victims. The system that had protected him for 7 years wouldn't change overnight. But in our small corner of the world, we'd won a battle. 23 families had stood together. We'd refused to be silenced, refused to let our children suffer alone, refused to accept that some casualties were inevitable in education. We'd learned that watching without watching could be its own form of power, that presence could be protest, that documentation could be defense, that parents united could move mountains, or at least remove one monster. The substitute teacher arrived the following Monday. She was older, grandmotherly, with kind eyes and a gentle voice. She removed the thinking chair entirely, replacing it with a reading corner full of pillows and books. Emma came home that day with paint on her dinosaur dress and a real smile on her face. She'd raised her hand in class. She'd answered a question wrong and nothing bad had happened. She'd asked to use the bathroom and simply went. Normal things. Beautiful, ordinary, precious things that Creep had turned into weapons of fear. Healing would take time. Some children would need years of therapy. Some families would never fully recover. The scars he'd inflicted would last long after his removal. But in his empty classroom, children were learning to breathe again, to speak, to make mistakes, to be imperfect without punishment. The investigation began immediately. Jules assigned 2 district officials to interview every family involved. They started with the children, bringing in specialists trained in trauma-informed questioning. Emma's interview lasted 3 hours. She came out exhausted, but somehow lighter, clutching a stuffed animal the interviewer had given her. I waited in the hallway with other parents, watching our children emerge one by one. Some cried, others looked relieved, a few seemed angry, finally given permission to express what they'd held inside for so long. The investigators took meticulous notes, recorded everything with parental consent, built their case methodically. Creep tried to interfere from administrative leave. He sent emails to parents not in our group, suggesting we were coaching our children, manipulating the investigation. He contacted the teachers' union, filed grievances about harassment. He even showed up at school during pickup, standing just off property, watching us with that same cold smile. The restraining orders came next. 17 families filed simultaneously. The judge, reviewing the evidence of threats to children, granted them all. Creep could no longer come within 500 feet of the school or any of the children named in the orders. His lawyer fought back, claiming the orders were excessive, that we were destroying an innocent man's career. But the anonymous notes to children, documented by multiple families, carried weight. The judge upheld every order. During the second week of investigation, more families came forward. Parents whose children had been in Creep's class years ago heard about the investigation through school gossip. They shared stories we'd never heard. A boy who'd developed selective mutism after 4th grade. A girl who'd started pulling out her hair. Twin brothers who'd gone from inseparable to barely speaking after their year with Creep. The pattern expanded beyond what we'd known. 7 years became 10. 23 families became 35. The investigators' files grew thick with testimony. Nathan, the janitor, finally gave his statement. He described finding children hiding in supply closets, terrified to return to class. He'd documented dates when he'd cleaned up accidents, though he'd never reported them, not wanting to embarrass the children further. His maintenance logs corroborated our timeline perfectly. The substitute teacher, Mrs. Mrs. Quint, transformed the classroom atmosphere. She implemented morning circles where children shared their feelings. She created a peace corner with soft cushions and calming activities. She never raised her voice, never used shame as a tool. The children bloomed under her care like flowers after a drought. Emma started singing again. I'd forgotten she used to sing constantly, making up silly songs about everything. The silence had crept in so gradually I hadn't noticed until it lifted. Now she hummed while brushing her teeth, sang to her stuffed animals, performed concerts for anyone who'd listen. Other changes emerged slowly. Jackson stopped asking permission for everything. Lily began telling jokes again. Aiden's stutter faded as his confidence grew. They were remembering who they'd been before Creep. The investigation expanded. Jules's team examined Creep's previous schools, tracking his employment history. They found gaps, sudden departures, schools that wouldn't comment on why he'd left. The pattern stretched back 15 years across 3 states. We learned he'd never stayed anywhere longer than 7 years. Always left voluntarily. Always with glowing recommendations that focused on his committee work, his volunteering, never his actual teaching. The recommendations were carefully worded, we realized later, to avoid liability while moving him along. His mother called me one evening. I don't know how she got my number. She cried, begged me to understand that her son was a good teacher, that children were just too sensitive these days. She said we were ruining his life over normal discipline. I listened to her pain, a mother defending her child, but I thought of Emma practicing holding her bladder at 3 a.m. I thanked her for calling and hung up. The school board meeting drew crowds. Parents filled every seat, stood along the walls, spilled into the hallway. The investigation findings were presented in clinical detail. 43 families affected over 15 years. Documented patterns of emotional abuse. Clear evidence of targeting vulnerable children. Creep's defenders spoke too. A few parents whose children had thrived in his class, who saw only the charming facade. They called him dedicated, innovative, unfairly persecuted. They blamed us for being overprotective, for coddling our children, but the evidence was overwhelming. The board voted unanimously to terminate his employment and revoke his teaching license in our state. They also implemented new policies for classroom observation, mandatory reporting training, and student wellness checks. Creep didn't attend the meeting, but his lawyer read a statement maintaining his innocence, blaming a witch hunt, promising to appeal. The words felt hollow against the weight of 43 families' pain. Some parents celebrated that night, others just felt empty. The victory was necessary but incomplete. He could still move to another state, get licensed there, find new victims. The system that had enabled him for 15 years had changed in only small ways. I found Emma in her room that night, drawing. Not the dark scribbles from before, but a picture of her classroom with Mrs. Quint and all her friends. She'd drawn herself raising her hand, a huge smile on her face. The healing continued in waves. Good days followed by setbacks. Nightmares that came less frequently but still came. Therapy appointments that slowly shifted from crisis management to processing and growth. Support group meetings where parents shared resources and victories. Marcus started speaking at schools about recognizing abuse. He turned his pain into purpose, teaching other children to trust their instincts, to tell trusted adults, to know that whispered cruelties weren't normal discipline. His mother stood proud at every presentation. The civil suits began 6 months later. Not for money, though damages were sought, for accountability, for formal acknowledgement of harm, for resources to pay for the therapy our children needed. 30 families joined the suit against the district for negligent supervision. The district settled quickly, quietly. They couldn't afford the publicity of a trial. The settlement funded therapy for affected children, implemented new oversight policies, required additional training for all staff. It wasn't justice exactly, but it was something. Creep moved to another state. We tracked him through teacher licensing databases, warned parent groups there. Some listened, others dismissed us as vindictive. He found another school, another 4th grade class. The cycle threatened to continue, but we'd changed too. We'd learned to trust our instincts, to question authority, to fight for our children even when the system failed them. We'd discovered the power of collective action, of refusing to be silenced. The parent network evolved into something larger, a watchdog group monitoring classroom practices, a support system for families facing similar situations, a voice for children who couldn't speak for themselves. We created the infrastructure that should have existed all along. Emma entered 5th grade confident and healing. She still had difficult days, moments when shadows crossed her face, but she knew she was believed, protected, valued. She joined student council, started a kindness club, became the child who looked out for others who seemed sad. One afternoon, I found her writing in her journal. She showed me the entry. I'm glad we stopped Mr. Creep, not for revenge, but so other kids don't get hurt. Sometimes bad things happen, but good people can work together to make things better. Her wisdom, born from pain, but nurtured by love, took my breath away. The other families found their own paths forward. Some moved away, seeking fresh starts. Others became advocates, channeling their anger into change. The timing of Creep's mother calling feels oddly convenient. She manages to get a private number and delivers the perfect "my son is misunderstood" speech that makes me wonder who's really pulling strings behind the scenes. A few struggled, unable to move past the trauma. We supported each other as best we could. Jackson's family started a foundation providing free counseling for children experiencing school-based trauma. Lily's mom became a district advocate for student welfare. Aiden's grandmother ran for school board and won, promising never to dismiss parental concerns again. The ripples spread beyond our immediate circle. Other schools in the district implemented observation policies. Teachers received training on recognizing signs of colleague misconduct. Parents felt empowered to question, to volunteer, to stay involved. It wasn't perfect. Systems changed slowly, and people resist admitting failures. But in our small corner of the world, children were safer. That mattered. Years would pass before we'd fully understand the impact. Some children would struggle into adolescence with trust issues, anxiety, the deep wounds left by someone who was supposed to nurture them. Others would emerge stronger, more empathetic, determined to protect others from similar harm. Emma kept that journal entry, that simple wisdom about good people working together. It became her compass. voice, guiding her toward a life of advocacy and compassion. She'd been broken by cruelty, but refused to let it define her limits. The thinking chair was destroyed. Mrs. Quint had it removed from storage and dismantled, the pieces discarded separately so it could never be reassembled. A symbolic gesture, perhaps, but symbols matter when recovering from trauma. In its place, the classroom gained a reading nook, a quiet corner with soft pillows and gentle lighting where children could retreat when overwhelmed, a place of comfort instead of punishment, of healing instead of harm. The investigation report became part of Creep's permanent record, not enough to prevent him from teaching elsewhere, but enough to make hiring him risky. Small protection for future children, but better than the nothing that had existed before. Our living room, once filled with angry, frightened parents, now hosted different gatherings, birthday parties for children who'd found their joy again, support meetings for families still struggling, planning sessions for advocacy work. The space that had witnessed our darkest fears now held hope. Emma grew stronger each day. She learned to recognize manipulation, to trust her instincts, to speak up when something felt wrong. The lessons came too early, forced by circumstances no child should face, but she carried them with grace. She forgave more easily than I did. Not Crete, she was clear about that, but the system that failed her, the adults who should have seen, the classmates who'd watched her suffer. She chose to focus on those who'd fought for her, rather than those who'd failed her. Her strength amazed me. Where I saw damage, she saw growth. Where I felt rage, she found purpose. She transformed trauma into empathy, fear into determination, silence into advocacy. The network we'd built saved other children. Parents reached out when they noticed concerning changes. We shared resources, offered support, validated concerns. We became the early warning system that institutions had failed to provide. Not every story ended well. Some children never fully recovered. Some families fractured under the strain. Some parents couldn't move past their guilt for not seeing sooner, not acting faster. Trauma ripples outward, touching everything. But in the arithmetic of harm prevented, we'd made a difference. Every child spared Creep's whispers. Every family that recognized warning signs early. Every teacher who thought twice before using shame as a tool. The impact multiplied beyond our initial group. Emma started middle school with friends who understood her journey. Children who'd shared similar experiences, who didn't need explanations for certain triggers or behaviors. They supported each other with the wisdom of survivors. The annual remembrance wasn't planned. It simply happened. Every year on the anniversary of Creep's removal, families gathered at the park, not to dwell on pain, but to celebrate survival. Children played while parents talked. New families facing similar situations found community. Hope mingled with memory. Mrs. Quint stayed at the school, becoming the teacher children requested, the one parents trusted. She never spoke of Creep, but worked daily to undo his damage. Her classroom became a haven, proof that education could nurture rather than harm. Some called us helicopter parents. Others said we'd overreacted, but they hadn't seen their children practice holding their bladders in the middle of the night. They hadn't watched bright spirits dim to nothing. They hadn't felt the weight of institutional indifference. We'd learned that protecting children sometimes required breaking social contracts, challenging authority, refusing to be polite when politeness enabled abuse. We'd learned that collective action could move mountains, even small ones. The scars remained, they always would. But scars could be proof of survival, maps of resilience, reminders of battles won. Our children bore them with increasing pride as years passed, evidence of their strength rather than their victimization. Emma's dinosaur dress hung in her closet long after she'd outgrown it, a reminder of who she'd been before, who she was becoming after. Sometimes I'd find her holding it, not with sadness, but with something like gratitude for the journey between then and now. Change came slowly to the education system. Policies written, training mandated, oversight increased, but real change lived in the parents who paid attention, the teachers who spoke up, the children who knew their voices mattered. We'd started as 12 frightened families in a living room. We'd become something larger, stronger, more enduring than any individual trauma. We'd become proof that ordinary people could fight extraordinary battles when their children's well-being was at stake. The war against institutional indifference continued, would always continue. But in our small victory, we'd shown that battles could be won, that monsters could be stopped, that children could be protected when adults found their courage. Emma thrived, not in spite of what happened, but because of how we'd responded. She learned that pain could be acknowledged, that adults would fight for her, that her voice had power, lessons that would serve her throughout life. The empty thinking chair had been replaced with possibility. Where fear once ruled, curiosity bloomed. Where silence had been enforced, voices rang out. Where one man's cruelty had thrived, a community's love had triumphed. It was enough. Not perfect, not complete, but enough. Our children were safe, healing, learning to trust again. We'd faced down a monster and won, not through violence or vengeance, but through persistence, solidarity, and refusal to accept the unacceptable. In the end, that's all any parent could do. Stand between their child and harm. Fight systems that enable abuse, build communities that protect the vulnerable, trust that collective action could create change, however small. Emma sang her way into adolescence, her voice clear and unafraid. The girl who'd once whispered in fear now spoke truth boldly. She'd been broken and rebuilt herself stronger. We all had. The thinking chair was gone, but its lessons remained. We'd learned to recognize the signs, to trust our instincts, to act on concern rather than wait for proof. We'd learned that sometimes the greatest courage was simply refusing to look away. Our story became one of many, shared in support groups, whispered at school gatherings, passed between parents like a warning and a promise. Yes, this could happen. Yes, you could fight back. Yes, you could win. Not everyone would. Systems protected predators more than victims, but every victory mattered. Every child spared. Every family awakened. Every community that chose vigilance over comfort. Emma wrote essays about resilience, about the power of community action, about adults who'd refused to let her suffer in silence. violence. She transformed trauma into purpose, becoming the advocate she'd needed. The cycle of harm stopped with her, replaced by cycles of healing and protection. We'd won our battle. The war continued elsewhere, would always continue. But in our corner of the world, children went to school without fear. Parents volunteered without apology. Teachers understood they were watched, accountable, expected to nurture rather than harm. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Appreciate you letting me be that clever little voice whispering in your ear the whole time. Hopefully more helpful than annoying. Catch you on the flip side. Subscribe for more content like this.